Hello and welcome to this week's podcast episode. First of all, thank you for joining us for Neurodiversity Celebration Week. It was amazing. It was, I'm just going to say, a resounding success. There was a massive there's been over 8,000 downloads throughout March, and as a result of the week and our podcast, and huge thanks to all of the guests that we had on and everyone who engaged, listened, got in touch with their stories and questions and aha moments. Just massive appreciation. Thank you for sharing the podcast with friends and family and your community and just getting involved. It's been really awesome. If you want to get more involved, of course, you can subscribe at ourgiftedkids.com. We have a free ebook on there, a free What is Gifted course, and all sorts of resources, and you can find a link in the show notes. April is Autism Awareness Month. Well, actually, there's like a day, there's a week, so I'm just going to call it the whole month, whether that's the whole thing or not. And so I'm delighted actually to share today's episode with our guest who is also autistic. So I thought that was a nice kind of roundup. Her name is Allison Davies, and she's pretty freaking amazing. She creates online resources for parents and teachers seeking guidance around how to use music therapeutically in their own lives and to reclaim their inherent musicality along the way. She works within a neurodiversity framework that favours regulation over intervention and sharing her lived experience of autism. Allison empowers others to use music as a tool for neuroregulation at home and in the classroom. She is a music therapist, a researcher, and her programs, workshops, and speaking events have received international acclaim for their ability to deliver light bulb moments and shift paradigms away from behavioural management and towards brain care. So you're in for a great episode today. I love her work. I just love it. And I highly recommend following her and checking her out. All her details are in the show notes. She's just one of those super brilliant people pulling together the things that she loves to really make an impact and share with parents a new way of looking at behaviour and the way our brain impacts our behaviour. It's an absolute don't miss out. So today we talk about exactly that. How does our brain impact our behaviour? Are kids being naughty, or is it actually something going on with their brain? And how can we use music to regulate? And so this episode might just change the way you parent. Certainly will change the way you look at behaviour. Yes, we also talk about autism. And why, you might ask, is autism important for a podcast about giftedness? Well, gifted kids and gifted adults can also be autistic, just like they can have ADHD or be dyslexic or any number of learning and life challenges. Autism and giftedness can often be misdiagnosed for each other. In fact, there's been some research that suggests that if you go to, if a child was to get assessed by someone with a strength in giftedness, they may get a giftedness diagnosis. If that same child went to someone who had a strength in diagnosing autism, they may get an autism diagnosis. Research has actually shown that, which is fascinating. So there's obviously a lot of shared traits, and it's a very interesting crossover there. So it's important when we talk about giftedness that we also talk about things that can come along with that, things that can be aligned with that. In this episode, everything we talk about is about the brain and can apply to anyone with a brain. So it's not exclusively about the autistic brain or the gifted brain, but Allison's knowledge and tools will, of course, be of great benefit to anyone, especially those with a neurodivergent brain. So, and that includes giftedness, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, all of those things. So let me know what you think. You can find us in our Facebook group or on Instagram. I love to hear people's aha moments. I really cherish those and appreciate them. If you want to dig deeper, you can download our free ebook or free What is Gifted course at ourgiftedkids.com on the What is Gifted page. All of Allison's details are also in the show notes. She is freaking amazing, so follow her too. And thank you again for an absolutely amazing Neurodiversity Celebration Week. It was just totally blew me away. And thank you for engaging and getting involved, and to our amazing guests. I hope that you've taken that opportunity to follow and get to know them a bit better. And I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. So thanks so much. Bye. Hi, I'm Sophia Elliott. As a parent of 3 gifted kids, I'm here to talk about all things gifted. Because I've been isolated and uncertain, and I felt like that parent. Then I found peace of mind, support, and my community. This podcast is about sharing that journey, actually parenting gifted kids, and connecting with advice and support. So we have everything we need for every member of our family to thrive. This is the Our Gifted Kid podcast. I'm super excited today to have Allison Davies on the podcast, which is very exciting because we've had some technical hiccups. Allison, welcome to the podcast. I thought perhaps we could start by having a quick chat about what you do and who you're serving at the moment.
Sure. Well, I've just come out of 16 years of being a registered music therapist, and I've just left that profession. And so it's exciting times. I'm starting a whole new chapter right now. And right now I am an independent liberatory scholar, which means I'm researching, and I've chosen, rather than to do a PhD, I've chosen to research independently with some fabulous mentors and supervisors. And my research is based in liberation. So I am looking at deconstructing the idea that some people are musical and some people are non-musical. And my hope there is to really help people to understand that to be human is to be musical. There's no such thing as out of tune. And, we can all express ourselves musically. And so, I feel like this research hopefully is going to be serving a lot of people, maybe all of us.
Absolutely.
That's my big vision anyway.
Yeah. And that is a really big vision. And congratulations on like you say, studying a whole new chapter and doing something that sounds like you're very passionate about, and just trying something a bit different. That's really exciting.
Yeah. I mean, it was scary as well because I had to let go of an identity that I've had for more than half of my life. I spent 6 years at university to get to the point where I was as a music therapist. And then I trained with the Academy of Neurologic Music Therapy. So I could really specialize in understanding the brain and how it works and the relationship between music and the brain. And so it's really defined me for a long time. And it still does. It's just that I no longer identify as a therapist, and now I identify as a researcher. So I'm still creating the same work in the world, and not a lot has changed. More so my identity, I think, has changed.
Yeah, which, like you say, can take some getting used to. That definitely resonates with my own journey of late, to be honest. So while you're researching, we can still access your e-course and your online community. Perhaps tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So these are my sort of babies. I've got 2 resources that are my sort of favorite things that I've produced in the world work-wise. So I've got my 10-week e-course, Brains Equal Behaviours, and that will continue. That has always run twice a year online, and that's all about understanding our children's brains, how they develop, and we place expectations on children that are far beyond what their brain can actually achieve. And that's because we don't understand, because, so much of what we've learned in the brain about the brain, we've only learned in the last 20 years. So we're still very firmly entrenched in a behavioral based paradigm. But now we have so much science about how the brain develops, we really need to start adjusting our expectations on children. So that the Brains Equal Behaviours is all about that. It's also about really deeply accepting neurodivergence. And I'm an autistic woman and my children are neurodivergent. So I'm very passionate about sort of shifting the way we think about supporting our children so that it's not so much about, I never want my resources to be sort of used for people to like, we don't want our children's brains to be better, faster, stronger, more
Yeah.
like someone else's. I'm not into comparing. I'm into deeply and wildly accepting their own neurotype, their own trajectory of development, and celebrating exactly where they are. And we use music to support the brain to regulate. So that's what Brains Equal Behaviours is all about, understanding the brain and using music-based strategies, not to improve functionality or anything like that, but just to support the brain to regulate and feel safe and nurtured and loved.
I love that. I really do love that. Likewise, my children are, as am I, neurodivergent. And my own journey over the last few years has been very much about understanding the brain, our brains, and the impact of that, especially as a parent and parenting. And that really resonates with me. It's kind of like the more information we have, we can know what to expect. And even before then, in my parenting journey, I was always asking that question of, is it reasonable for me to expect this of my child? Like, is that a reasonable thing? And often that wasn't a clear answer, but it's just always questioning. And I think that's actually a really healthy thing to do. And so beyond the course, you also have a community called the Brain Care Cafe.
I do. So the Brain Care Cafe is my online membership. The Brains Equal Behaviours is contextualized around understanding our children's brains and supporting our children. The Brain Care Cafe is for adults. And whilst the strategies that we do in the Brain Care Cafe can absolutely be used with our children and for our children, this one's really about us supporting our own brain. And my definition of brain care is giving our brain more of what helps it run and less of what shuts it down. And the reason we use music-based strategies as a tool for regulation and a tool for supporting our brain to feel safe and in control as opposed to confused and overwhelmed is that the relationship between music and the brain is just off the charts. So when science shows us that when we experience music, more of our brain becomes active simultaneously than it does when we experience any other thing.
Mm-hmm.
So the relationship, the impact that music has on our brain is huge. So much of our brain becomes active, and that helps us integrate and process and move emotions and all of the things that we need to do to feel our best and our safest. So yes, the Brain Care Cafe, Brains Equal Behaviours, the e-course, is sort of very information dense, where you learn a lot. It's very sciencey and very exciting, and you learn a lot. And the Brain Care Cafe is kind of strategy dense. So we have a lot of brain care strategies, which are tiny, tiny, tiny musical experiences that are strategically used because we know that they support our brain to feel safe and to regulate.
Mm-hmm. That's very exciting and very intriguing. That's kind of ticking all my boxes. I love brain sciencey stuff and very practical strategies and tools that I can use, for myself or with my kids. I thought it might be helpful today if we kind of talked through a few kind of real world examples to help us get our heads around how we might use music sort of strategies in our parenting.
Yeah.
So how does thinking about our children's behavior from this perspective of the way the brain works help us as a parent if we're supporting a child who maybe has a lot of anger?
Okay. So all behaviors are always the byproduct of what's going on in the brain.
Yeah.
So the first thing is, whenever we focus on the behavior, so if a child is experiencing anger, and I like to say experiencing anger rather than is an angry child, because we know that all emotions are transient. Emotion literally means energy in motion. So it's just an energy that is moving through us. It's not a state that we permanently are in. So if a child is experiencing anger, which they will, because we're all human and all of us will, however that is externalizing behaviorally, that's not the focus. So the first thing is to move away from the focus being the hitting, the punching, the hole in the wall, all of the angry sort of behaviors that we would associate, and to recognize that they their brain is in survival. Our brain goes into survival mode very quickly these days for most of us, because this modern Western world we live in is surrounded by sensory input, too much sensory input, too much information, so many options, so many choices. And because of our fast-paced life where there's so many expectations, so many things we're getting done, we're moving quickly to do all the things, it's just so fast that our brains are many parts of our brains are sort of in this heightened state of arousal, or like highly stimulated. And that's adults and children alike, which means that some parts of our brain are going to be going overboard. The little part of the brain right in the middle called the amygdala, which detects our threat responses. If that's highly active, we want our amygdala to pick up threats, but not like every second noise or movement that wasn't expected in the room. But if our brains and our children's brains are highly active or overactive or highly stimulated because of all this modern world we live in, then their brain will be basically jumping at all of these. There's a noise, there's something unexpected. I don't know who that was. What's this? And the brain's like, okay, these are all potential threats. I'm not quite sure what to make of all of this. So let's just go into survival mode to ensure you're safe, because our brain's only job in the world is to keep us alive. That's its only job. So whenever it's overwhelmed, it'll put us straight into survival mode just in case it's missing anything important, so that we have the best chance of saving our own lives. So it sounds very dramatic, but the brain doesn't know the difference between real threats and perceived threats, which is why children will be experiencing anger. So it's always, when we understand it from that perspective, it makes so much more sense to support our children in a way that allows them to slow down, allows them to feel safe, that create an environment for your child that they feel connected to you as a parent or a caregiver, that they feel nurtured and loved and safe. And all of those things are the things that's going to help the brain come out of survival mode. So it's a complete different spin on how we manage behaviors, because it's always been about focusing on the behavior, like we don't hit.
So is it,
and this is completely different.
So is it focusing more on the foundational feelings of safety and security and connection, as opposed to being very responsively, focusing on the being responsive to emotions as they're expressed, whether that's anger or whatever?
Yes. So it's kind of a preemptive thing. When a child is in an emotional outburst, I saw this beautiful meme yesterday which said meltdown, and it had been crossed out, tantrum crossed out, and then underneath it said emotional release.
Yes.
And that's what anything like that is. An angry outburst, a child smashing a window, throwing rocks at someone. I'm going all to like, the big aggressive behaviors.
Yes. Or an adult shouting,
or an adult shout. So it's exactly the same for children as adults. And so when we are supporting, when they are having an emotional release, it's happening.
Yes.
And the best thing you can do, and this is what I suggest for meltdowns as well. There's two things you can do in the middle of a meltdown or an emotional release, is just as best as you can remove any direct triggers. So if you know that there is a noisy thing happening, or there was a flashing light happening, and you can easily just turn that off and fix that trigger, well then do that.
Or like a sibling.
Don't try and micromanage the triggers, but just if there's something obvious. And then the other thing is, just as best as you can, make sure that everyone who's in that area is safe. So, you can't get in there and stop it while it's happening. So when the emotional release, when the angry outburst is happening, it's happening. And then as soon as it's finished, you move into the comfort stage where you tell the child they are loved, they are safe, it's okay, it's not their fault. Sometimes traditionally that's when people have gone in with punishments and like, okay, you shouldn't have done that. But we know that a brain that is dysregulated needs to feel safe and loved and validated to be able to regulate.
That makes so much sense.
It's really hard for us adults because we are one of the first generations to know this science. So we're one of the first generations to move past what we are deeply conditioned into,
Mm-hmm.
which is to look at the behaviors and manage the behaviors and reward or punish behaviors, because that's what our generations have always done at school and at home.
Yeah.
So it's hard for us, and it can be really hard after an angry outburst to then just come in with love and compassion and support. But as soon as you have then been able to reconnect and your child feels safe, then you are straight back into what I call the management stage, which is finding ways, little moments in your lifestyle every day to support your little one's brain to feel safe. And that is the best way you can reduce the likelihood of them being in survival mode. So what you're doing then is helping delay the next meltdown. And it's never going to stop. I'm never, ever against stopping angry outbursts, because we're human. So we will absolutely have them no matter what happens. But when we are consciously creating an environment for our children, or finding ways to support their regulatory needs day to day when things are going fine, not when they're already going into that angry space, that's when we end up developing a sort of a bigger window of tolerance for them, or more capacity, more resources for them, before they start to get into that heightened state where they're not coping so well with their emotions.
Yeah. So really understanding those foundational pieces around creating that environment. And so as you were talking there, I'm imagining a massive declutter of my house.
Yep.
Which seems to be like we've been on that mission for the last 6 years. But, you know, and it really resonates with me, because there's so much of our modern environment is constant. And even with adults, like a couple of months ago, I turned off all notifications on my phone, on my watch. I get a text message or a phone call, and that is it now. And I didn't realize until I did that how hyper alert I had become on this constant state of, you know, tension and hyper alertness, just because of these notifications all the time. And so it is relentless, and our kids are growing up in that environment as well. So the big message I'm getting is, let's have a good look at our immediate environment, how that's serving our needs. And no doubt you've got a bunch of strategies around creating that environment and stuff. And then in the moment of these emotional releases, because, you know, our kids do it, we all do it, we're all human, all sorts of emotions come out, and it's really important that they do. It's kind of just, I guess, stepping back, honoring that moment for a minute, making sure they feel safe, everyone's safe, and then coming in with the love and support, as opposed to discipline, you know, old school discipline and consequences. And
I think probably the most important point to reiterate right now is that it's really bloody hard.
Yes.
Like, there is nothing easy about honoring a meltdown or an angry outburst. There is nothing easy about us staying regulated and consciously in control enough to then come in and not start to discipline. It's so hard for us to come in with love. And, you know, I remember one time after a meltdown a few years ago, it was a really big one. There was like kind of 3 hours there of really hard work, and I had strangers, you know, other adults had to come and help me. And, you know, it wasn't my meltdown, it was a child, and I had another child with me, and it was in a place where it was just really awkward. It was a really, really hard one.
Yeah.
And at the end of that, when we could finally kind of get in the car and drive again, I went to the bakery and bought the kids treats, like Kiss biscuits with icing on them. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Like, I was so, like, I had nothing left in me. I was so empty. I was so terrified. I was so traumatized. I was so triggered. I've almost got tears remembering it. And I mean, it doesn't seem like a big deal really, but for me to drive straight from that situation to go and buy treats for them was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I just really felt like if any other parent saw what I was doing right now, they'd be like, "You're so soft on them. You should be, this is your fault. You're not blah, blah, blah. It's really, really hard to be the person who understands the science and makes parenting choices based on that, when you know that all around you are going to be people who only see the behaviors and only see what they perceive is the right or wrong way of you responding to that. And so it's very, very hard. It's not an easy thing, but it is the right thing.
Yeah, and I absolutely hear you on that. There's so much judgment at the best of times, which is awful. And I've certainly heard myself that accusation of being soft from folk who honestly don't understand the complexities of my kids and the reasons why, they're, like you say, they're having that emotional release at that point in time. And it's kind of like, they're not misbehaving. They're in this state because they're really tired. They're hungry. There's been a lot of change recently, and they're overloaded with it, sensory overloaded, or any number of complicated factors. Yeah, everything. And it's like, as a parent in that moment, they don't need discipline. They need that love, and they need to feel safe. And especially with older generations, but even any generation, there's definitely a lot of judgment around being soft. I hear that a lot from parents and that kind of thing. And as you're talking there, I'm kind of imagining my own trio. I have 3 kids, 4, 7, and 9, who are all most likely neurodiverse and complicated little people. And sometimes they all kind of reach the end of their rope, and they're at each other and in each other's face. And those can be really, really hard days, really hard to come in with the love and different approaches. So I'm always looking for tools and strategies. Two things I was curious in asking you about in terms of how it relates to the brain and behavior in particular is anxiety and hyperactivity. So anxiety comes up quite a lot because I think this demographic of folk that we're kind of talking about predominantly are anxious, but also incredibly hyperactive as that brain function oozes out into the physical movement. So any thoughts on those particular areas?
Yeah. Lots.
Yeah, I know, like it's probably, we'll come back in 6 hours.
I'll try and keep it quick. I'm going to separate them for to begin with. So let's look at hyperactivity. There's a couple of things. All humans and children, all adults and children, all humans will experience hyperactivity. When you research hyperactivity, all you're going to find is information about ADHD. And it's only part of the story because, like I said, our brains are in a hyperstimulated and hyperactive state. So child or adult alike, when we are in a heightened state of arousal, our brain becomes highly active. So there's this part of the brain, like right under where my headphones sit across the front of the head there, the top of the head, called the motor cortex. That part of the brain is in control of all of our movements. It is prone to hyperstimulation very easily, especially in relation to the things that we're hearing. Auditory input, the things we hear, and the motor cortex have one of the strongest relationships in the brain in terms of neural pathways. So the things that we hear really impact how our body will move. So if we're in a noisy place, if we're in a supermarket, in the schoolyard, and there's kids everywhere, or in a classroom, and there's just hectic noises all over the place, the brain will become, the motor cortex will become hyperstimulated, and we will therefore move a lot, and we will wriggle around, and we will run, and we'll be fast, and we'll be hyperactive. That's all of us. That's all.
You've just described my kids going shopping.
Yes. And adults experience it too, but because we have more highly developed executive functions than our children, we can just cope with it, and then it comes out in a different way, or we channel it into something else. Like we channel it into like the thing we're doing in the shop, or we channel it into like madly trying to find the right brand of the thing we're looking for. So it's less it's less visible in an adult than it is in a child, but it's still. And then there are people who are neurodivergent who experience hyperactivity as part of their neurotype, and that's who they are. And it's not because their brain is just in this heightened state because of the environment. It probably also is, but that is who they are. And I think too often we focus on trying to reduce hyperactivity in children or people whose neurotype includes physical hyperactivity. And that's not really the best way we can support. If someone is actually hyperactive because of their neurotype, like I am, accepting that hyperactivity and finding ways to use it and live with it and accept it and channel it and love it are the best ways we can support our child's brain to feel safe, in control and loved. And that is the best way for them to stay regulated. So adding anxiety into that, because we are often trying to reduce hyperactivity in a brain that is their natural state, and we're constantly trying to reduce it, the brain is going to start to feel like confused, like, hang on, but this is who I am. Like, I can't do this. I can't sit on the mat. I can't not move my fingers and all of those kinds of things. And then the brain will go into survival mode, because that's just not what that brain is meant to do. Survival mode is anxiety. So survival mode is the thing that's happening in the brain. Anxiety is the physiological experience of that. So what we're feeling in the body is anxiety. So for many people who are hyperactive people or who are experiencing hyperactivity, when we try to what we call manage that, which means reduce it, so that they are more like the non-hyperactive children, what we're doing is perpetuating the anxiety.
Yeah.
For those of us who are experiencing anxiety and we are in survival mode, not necessarily because we're neurodivergent, just because we're humans in the world right now, which is like too much for anyone to cope with. So we're in survival mode. That can also amplify the hyperactivity that we're experiencing, because our brain is like, you've got to be aware of what's going on over there, quick, move, get home. And so we're in this heightened state. So they do go hand in hand. And as always, the best way to support our children's hyperactivity is not to try and reduce it, but to find ways to create an environment in which their brain feels safe, loved, and connected. And then their brain can be the best version of itself. And that might still be hyperactive if that's their neurotype, but it might be that it's less, or it might be that it's easier. For them, and they experience more regulation, and the anxiety might go. They might still experience hyperactivity because that's who they are. But it always comes back to finding ways for the brain to feel safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, that's a very different way of looking at hyperactivity and anxiety. And it makes so much sense. You know, we can't just continue to squash people's natural instincts, like hyperactivity. Absolutely. Okay, thank you very much for that. That's food for thought. I'm going to mull that over for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, can I add for like a child, just say a child with ADHD, we might, or a teacher might, and we might, with the most beautiful, compassionate, holistic, child-centered intentions in mind, might find ways to support them to sit still or to sit at the desk at school and to do the things, so that we feel like once we put these supports in place and they're able to sit on the mat now, we feel like we've helped to support them. But what's actually happening for a child with ADHD who is now sitting still on the mat, they no longer have the same capacity to listen, engage, interact, feel safe, learn. So what we're seeing out externally is them sitting still, and we think we've helped. But what's happening internally is that now that they are putting all of their energy into doing this thing that everyone wants them to do, and they're doing it, they don't have the capacity then to learn and to actually feel safe. And that's where a lot of the dysregulation stems from.
That makes so much sense. It's like you can't learn when you're in survival mode. Right. you can't learn, you can't be creative, and that really resonates with me, and I think my kids as well. We've been having these conversations recently. So I was diagnosed with autism a few months ago. And so I've been going through a very interesting journey of reframing a lot of my lived experience into, that new identity, and understanding how those things manifest, and having those conversations with my children. And I think what we really fail to appreciate so much, and in so many different examples, is when we're working hard to be something that is not natural, to do something that is not a natural fit, especially when it comes to the way our brains are set up, it's like there's not a lot else going to go on, or there's not a lot else that's going to happen, because that so much energy is to going into that, and that's all got to come out or come apart at some point. So cue emotional release down the track. When that child who's had to sit on the mat all day, really focusing on being good, with, air quotes there, hasn't learnt, during the day, because probably getting very hyperactive at lunchtime and probably falling apart as soon as they get home. Because of just that intensity.
And also creating stories of shame in their mind. Like, why can't I do this? I can't do, I'm dumb. I'm silly. I'm like too silly. I'm not good enough. And they're the kind of stories that stick.
Absolutely. I did a podcast only recently with Dr. Geraldine Townsend about self-concept in 2E kids. And she was saying how at these very early ages, in these early schooling years, that negative cycle is impacting a child's self-concept already, which they then inevitably carry on through for most of their life. So that you can imagine this small child in reception, grade 1, grade 2, sit on the mat, no, don't do that, sit on the mat, no, don't do that, sit on the mat. And the messages they're getting is, I'm not good, I'm bad, I can't sit on the mat like everyone else. And that's becoming a part of their sense of identity. That's really scary.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
The mental health of neurodivergent people who have an expectation on them to achieve in the same way as non-neurodivergent children. And that's often the ones who the world calls high functioning, which we don't like that word. And that word is misleading, and it's a myth, and there's no such thing as high or low functioning. But they are typically the people who are expected to be able to achieve or do things the way non-neurodivergent children are doing them. And it has a huge impact on our mental health. And it's a real problem,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so for any of our listeners who haven't come across either the terms high and low functioning, or the challenges around those terms, and why they're not actually very representative of those two groups, do you want to quickly explain that?
Sure. I can speak in context of autism because I'm an autistic person, so I'll do that. Often we think of autism as a spectrum. And when we think of a spectrum, we think of a line. We think of it as a linear thing, like a volume knob where it's minimum and maximum, and as you turn the knob, you're somewhere on that line of volume. That's the way a lot of people think autism is. We think there's severe autism or low functioning at one end, and then at the other end it's high functioning. And I think initially those functioning labels were brought in to determine like support needs and funding and stuff like that. And it's become part of just the narrative of how we talk about people. And it's detrimental to everybody who's autistic or neurodivergent, because when you think of people who are non-speaking or who have very complex support needs as low functioning, we are completely undermining their intelligence, their capacity, their potential, what they can bring to the world, their potential, and the fact that they can live very fulfilling lives without meeting the milestones that the world says you need to meet. And when you call people high functioning, you are undermining their trauma, their pain, their absolute, like the way we spend our entire life trying to work out what the hell we're meant to be doing so that we can fit into all of these neuronormative expectations around us. And it's very, very painful and traumatic. And it's harder than you can imagine. And so when you use any of those functioning labels, you are completely misidentifying what autism is in the first place. And you're really also diminishing individual people. They're very harmful. Functioning labels are very harmful. But,
Mhm.
People don't know that. So thank you for
Yeah.
asking, because a lot of people don't know that. And they think, well,
Yeah.
they're just the words we use.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also, just quickly, because we're talking about kind of labels and perceptions, it's that idea around, people will say, well, it's a spectrum. We're all on the spectrum somewhere.
Oh,
Do you want to go into that one quickly for us?
The thing is, we do all have brains.
We do.
All humans
It's
have
true.
brains. So all of our brains will do things like have meltdowns, be in survival mode, be anxious, be hyperactive, have preferences for routines that help it be predictable. So all of us will experience all the things that brains do. But it is very, very different to be neurodivergent, where everything about our entire life depends or is a brain that foundationally only works that way. So when someone says we're all a little bit on the spectrum, what they're saying is, what's happening is that our neurotype is being denied and invalidated. And also it's a sign that they do not understand how complex our support needs are. So it's very invalidating. It's a very hard thing. People say that to us, I think, to be kind, because they're like, oh, I think a lot of people say it like, oh, we're all a little bit on the spectrum, as people say it to me a lot. And I think they do it to be like, it's okay, you're one of us. we're all a little bit like that. And, it's not the case. And I want people to understand that my identity is autistic. I'm not non-autistic. Nothing about me is non-autistic. And so for me, when I hear that, the hardest thing is that people think that the kind thing or the compassionate thing is to help you feel less autistic.
Yeah.
And the autistic community are like, hey, we're here, we're celebrating, like we are autistic, and that I would not change it.
Yeah.
I could not imagine the kind of
Mhm.
person I would be if I was not autistic. Like there's nothing about it, apart from the real difficulties that we live with, which are not to be minimized. I still wouldn't change a thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that I wonder is that I think some of that is the struggle of understanding like the many strengths that come with not just autism, but being neurodiverse. As an autistic person, there are many strengths in terms of our brains and brain function. Where ADHD or being dyslexic unlocks a lot of creativity in people. And so for me, I think a part of that is about always focusing on the deficit and not really understanding or seeing actually they come hand in hand with many strengths as well. So it's kind of like, so I think that's part of it. And it's also sort of, we're all a little bit quirky. And it's like, actually, I didn't know, because I know a lot of quirky folk, but, they're all very neurodiverse. I think, I don't know. We're all on the spectrum. And one event that stands out for me was I was having a conversation last year with a psychologist that my children were seeing. And we're obviously talking about autism and looking at that as a diagnosis. And I said to the psychologist, I'm like, I actually think I might be autistic, and that's something I'm looking at. And she said to me, oh, well, we're all a little on the spectrum. And I kind of went, Okay.
It's
Yeah.
really
Um,
hard when it comes from doctors and
yeah.
healthcare professionals.
Yeah. And that really stuck with me because it was, like you said, very invalidating of what I'd
Yes.
just said.
Yeah.
But also that person actually assesses
Yeah.
autism.
Yes.
And so as I've learnt a lot more, and the learning curve has been huge in the last 12 months, I now look back at that and I'm like, wow, that's actually really not cool.
Yeah.
And I think, most people just don't have that broader understanding. And it may have been something that I have said in the past, but I think it's something important to talk about and just help people understand actually why it's actually not a cool thing.
No.
Because you're either neurotypical or you're neuroatypical, and that's okay, strengths
Yeah.
and weaknesses, challenges and everything else, but let's not kind of diminish folk who are identifying as not being neurotypical.
Yeah.
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 So some big conversations there. And
Yeah.
I actually love that this all comes back to the brain and how the brain works, and that we can actually use that very science, that obviously appeals to me, using the science and the data to parent and have that insight into my children and myself in terms of my own response to parenting and emotions, because children certainly do bring out emotions in us.
They do.
So thank you so much for kind of digging down into a few of those scenarios with us today. I absolutely love the idea of looking at all of this through how we can use music to help us sort of calm the brain and regulate the brain. And that's definitely something that I'm going to check out your stuff. I know you've got a couple of ebooks that people can check out your website, allisondavies.com.au.
Yes.
For some more information and tips, and to find the course and the community. And and kind of have a look at this different approach, which I think is just amazing. Wonderful.
Yeah. I love it as well. It just gives us permission to move away from focusing on behaviors when it feels so, I think for most of us now, instinctively, we feel that's not the way.
Yeah.
And this gives us the permission to be like, actually, you're right. This isn't the way.
Yeah.
Try this.
Yeah.
And I mean, for me, using music as the tool, as the regulatory tool, is obviously where I'm at as a former music therapist of 16 years. That's my passion and that's my area of interest. And so to be able to support people to use music strategically in tiny, tiny ways. This does not mean you have to be able to play an instrument or consider yourself musical or, do anything fancy. This is us using the most basic of music-based elements like rhythm and melody and silence and tempo and volume in tiny, tiny ways throughout our day, as part of our lifestyle. When we use those strategically to keep the brain feeling safe and in control, like we have, I went maybe 5 years ago, I was having meltdowns multiple a week, and I haven't had one for more than 2 years now. And, there could be a lot of reasons for that, but I really do attribute it to the way I am just piecing together tiny moments of brain and controlling my environment and understanding how my environment impacts me and changing it to the way I need.
Yeah.
And doing the best I can, like in terms of supporting and accommodating my particular brain. And it has just made the world of difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I've changed my language and understanding, and just even over the last few months, like, I can absolutely feel the difference. So if there's anyone out there thinking, and often I think when you're getting that mature diagnosis, it's because someone said, have you looked at autism or dyslexia, ADHD with your child? And then it's kind of a good opportunity to kind of go, I wonder where that might be coming from in the family.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with me? Because the empowerment from understanding yourself and then that lived experience with your child is huge.
Oh, like I would, it can be scary. I know that it can be scary for people, and that's legit. And it's a big emotional roller coaster, but I could never, ever, ever imagine going back to a life in which I didn't know that I was autistic.
Yeah.
And almost all of us who are being assessed as adults and diagnosed as adults it's happening because our children are being assessed and diagnosed.
Yeah.
And we know without a doubt that it's genetic. So it just puts pieces together. It makes sense, and it gives us an identity that just like can change our life.
Yeah. 100% echo that. It's definitely an emotional roller coaster, but it's
exhausting. It's a big
worth
deal.
going on. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for today. It's been such a wonderful conversation. I really do appreciate it. And I think, we talk about our gifted kids as obviously looking at, kids who are going through that process and that particular assessment, but that broader conversation it's about being neurodiverse. There's often a lot of complexities going on, and some of those behaviors that we see are anxiety, school refusal, depression, sensory overloads, meltdowns. So, what we've been talking about today is hugely relevant right across that kind of neurodiversity. I was going to say spectrum. That doesn't feel quite right. This conversation.
Throughout the world of neurodivergence.
That's exactly right.
The world of neurodivergence.
So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode and it inspired you in some way, I'd love to hear about your biggest takeaway in the comments. For more episodes, you can subscribe, and to help others find our podcast, please leave a review. You can find show notes and more resources at ourgiftedkids.com, and connect with us on Facebook and Instagram. See you in the same place next week.